Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Hope everybody had a Zissen Pesach, as they say in Yiddish, a good Passover and a happy Passover, and a good breaking of the Passover. And I have hope you have enjoyed all the leavening since Passover ended, every kind, every form. But hope y'all are doing well and feeling good and ready to move on. So we are back after a brief pause last week. We are back in Rabbi Sacks's book, and on a Parshat Acharei Mot, which we are in fact reading this week. I just double checked my calendar. We are correct. So wanted to see if y'all had any thoughts, reactions, comments before we dive in. That was me pretending I knew how to dive, but
okay, I waited 10 seconds.
You were counting. I could see you counting, Barbara. And I think, in my previous congregation, I would teach a class every, I think it was around Thursdays, Thursday a little around lunchtime too, but coincidence. But I'd have people go around and read, and the same guy always read first. He always volunteered to read first, and it got to a point where like he was out of town, and people were like, "What are we supposed to do? Like, who's going to read first if David's not here? Like, what do we do?" So I think everybody's waiting for Barbara to start the conversation.
I was waiting for
Barbara
Stuart.
doesn't start it. They don't know what to do until Barbara starts the conversation.
I was waiting for Stuart.
Take it away, Barbara.
Well, I appreciated the background that they brought up. And I mean, before this chapter, I'm only familiar with the modern interpretation of Baal Teshuvah, but I never had made the association, as Sacks does, between the 67 war and Baal Teshuvah, because I hadn't paid attention to the relative parts of the population that were on the path or off the path or returning to the path. So yeah, I found that very historically interesting. And then in terms of the background information, I appreciated it. But can I say whether I thought, or can I say whether I made the connection to the week's reading the Parsha without you telling me that it's okay for Rabbi Sacks to only use 2 words if that's all he wants to use?
It's a sign of a good Var if you don't have to go too far in. But I mean, look, he only cites a verse, but a good chunk of the first chapter is all about Yom Kippur. So I think launching off of there. Yes.
Well, just reading about the 67 war, what it reminded me of was 9/11. On both of those events, there was a lot of surprise involved, and it felt like a gut punch. I mean, it was terrible. And in some way, it rallied the people involved, just the country, especially the United States. It rallied us together. It wasn't a Jewish thing. I mean, this concept I don't think is necessarily Jewish, but I think it's a way that people who have become lost and wandering, quote unquote, come back together when they're stimulated by a major crisis. So it just felt like the same thing to me.
But do you think we're in one of those periods now, after October the 7th, that maybe that will lead to some?
Yes. No, I do. But of course, for either of those, we didn't have the backlash of what's happening post October 7th, which is very difficult to deal with.
I also thought immediately of 9/11, and I thought of where I was. So for me, it wasn't the 67 war, but the Yom Kippur War happened when I was in college. And I was still in college when 9/11 happened. I was on a different side of the podium, so I was dealing with my students' reactions to it. Whereas in the Yom Kippur War in the early 70s, 73, did I get that right? 73 or 72? 73. I was on the student side, and I had very close contact with a number of people who were packing up and flying off to Israel and going to be supportive and be in the IDF or go back to the IDF, etc. And I didn't have that in 9/11, but I could see it from our side here in the States of how the students were having their reactions and how it had been a shock for them. And so they were thinking of returning to an American way, which is not necessarily the American way that I was hoping for, which I think is a little bit what happened after October 7th, because October 7th, when it happened, there was so much support for Israel, even among the wider population, in the press, etc. And then the attitude has changed to more what I find really frustrating, what Stuart just mentioned as being really frustrating. But it was an interesting perspective to see it from the student side directly and the adult side, looking at student reactions. And Eddie did 9/11, did October 7th. How did it make you evaluate your own responses?
I'm not sure, other than, I mean, I think it's terrible to say it this way, but I think it does give you maybe more pride in your people to know that at least we can stand together, or the majority of us can stand together, and that we have to.
And Barbara, you mentioned the coming home, which is part of Rabbi Sacks's point, I think, in this particular. And I saw the coming home thing as a broader type of consideration. You know, when you're growing up and you go to Hebrew school, Sunday school, bar mitzvah, confirmation, you get inundated with all that. And then you go to college, and most people don't continue to do. Well, most people don't continue to do a lot of Jewish things in college, or probably immediately post college. And so, in our lives, I mean, I feel myself later in life coming back to Judaism in a way that I hadn't done previously. And so and I would like to hear how other people feel about that, but I think that's a very, very common way that your Jewish life changes over time. And just look at the people on this call. I think we're in that phase of our life, and that phase perhaps of being involved in Judaism. So I'd like to hear what other people think about that.
I'd like to let someone else go before I talk again, but I have something to say. TK.
Well, I'll just add to that I have found myself as I get older, connecting more with my Judaism. I don't know, and reevaluating my whole spiritual life, I guess you could call it, for lack of a better word. And definitely October 7th, I was in Iceland when that happened. And I had a visceral desire to be in a window in Israel looking down with a rifle in my hand. Of course, that calmed down afterwards, and I don't know that I would want to be with the idea of going after them. But in terms of defending, I was right there. It reminds me kind of a story that Sheldon Schaefer told us, if I may, real quickly. Sheldon was definitely an atheist, although he later kind of rearranged that term to mean something. He didn't really think it mattered whether there was God or not. You did what was right anyway. And he had a word for that, but he did not believe in God, and he really struggled and with the idea of Israel being any different from any other country in terms of what it did or it didn't do or whatever. And he went to Israel, and he said when the plane's wheels touched down, he burst into tears. And I had the same experience at the wall when I went to Israel. It didn't matter, what my theist beliefs were or weren't. It's a connection that's deeper than that. The end.
Somebody else want to share?
Could I tack on to that by saying I certainly burst into tears the first time I landed in Israel. But it's not that it's unfamiliar, it's that just suddenly you have a feeling that I belong to this. And I think those of us who have grown up in Jewish in Birmingham often wonder, after a number of experiences of being told you are not a part of this, I think the reaction was all the stronger. And yes, I'm definitely probably the elder of this group. And I definitely not only feel more of this, I feel that it's so important. The things that I did not learn when I was young, the things that were not important to a lot of the Jews that I was around. I feel I've got some things to make up. And it can't be done quickly. And I appreciate very much being in a group like this that has thought through the years and sought instruction, things to read, people to know, things to do that have made them more a part of their Jewish heritage. But I couldn't feel closer to it. And part of that was born probably by trying to explain to myself my father in Birmingham, who he became, what he was. He was just an immigrant's child. But he came out with very strong interest in understanding of America, democracy, what it was worth. And in the process, some of what my children, my grandchildren have been taught sort of went by the wayside. He was so busy dealing with Birmingham, Alabama. But one of the first times I tried to speak about him at Emmanuel, I realized that trying to explain him, one had to find out as much as one could about his grandfather, who brought all of that with him. And my father may not have had the heaviest, most educated lot of instruction, but the essentials were all there, and they definitely came from Judaism. It was just such a pleasing feeling to discover that.
I started to think in reading this, do I have a specific point in my life where I know I returned and became more active, as Stuart was describing? And I grew up in a very small town. So if you were Jewish, everybody knew each other. Everybody was in each other's backyards and pockets and dining room tables and everything. Because there were 7 Jewish families and maybe there were 15 or 20 kids among us. So that was it. And there was a congregation, but it just drew in all the farmers and everything from 20 miles away, 30 miles away. So there you had to actively do something to be Jewish. You were part of the community. When I went to college, big place, tons of Jews. You didn't have to do anything to be part of the Jewish community. Grad school, tons of Jews. You didn't have to do anything to be. I mean, we're talking New Jersey and Long Island, so talk about Jewish populations. But then after graduate school, I was in Pasadena. I was in the LA area, and at Caltech there were very few Jews. So we would find somebody, and then you would go to holiday services with them or put together a Seder or something like that. But it wasn't until I moved to Birmingham that I felt a desire to get really back into the community, because Birmingham was totally new. I knew no one. Well, we had relatives, but they were distant relatives. And one of the uncles said, okay, you guys belong at Temple Bethel. And as far as we knew, he called Temple Bethel and said, put my nephew and his girlfriend on, here's 2 new neighbors or 2 new members, and that's it. But Temple Bethel then offered stuff like this, or Sisterhood offered stuff like this, and I appreciated it. And that's how I returned. It wasn't a return in philosophy so much as it was a return in physical activity. And then it just grew from there. So that we were in a good place by the time we eventually had kids. The kids grew up in the Bethel community. And I'm pleased now to see my youngest one, who's in grad school, having joined a congregation, a small, diversified congregation, and playing an active role there. So I felt, okay, we made that one work. And then the oldest one, it's still all the leftover Jewish kids. Mostly they know each other from having lived in Boston. The Tufts and Brandeis kids all get together every holiday. So there's a community that they're building themselves. But my son has gotten into a more organized community, and community is important. So Stuart, I don't know if your situation was different, or Eddie, for example, moving from Demopolis to Birmingham, or even Auburn to Birmingham, that changed for you.
Yeah, it changed for me. We didn't have 7 families. We had 1 family. And we were the last one standing. When I was 13, I told my mom I wasn't going anymore because all the adults did was argue. I mean, there were only 12 of them, but they got into an argument every Friday night. So I'm just not going. Said, well, you're supposed to be an adult. So we got sent off to heavily Jewish schools. That was our Jewish education. So I had a Jewish roommate as a freshman, and my mom said, well, now you have some Jewish peers. What do you think about that? I said, oh my. My roommate was something else, but I went to a school with a large Jewish population, but nobody was really involved in anything Jewish. That was, about the same time period as you, Stuart. But then when I went to Auburn, I was, when I went back to school, there was a group there. So that's when I started going back. And then I
Well,
worked across the street from Emmanuel, so my grandmother wanted to see where I worked, and she came up and she said, "Well, there's Temple Emmanuel. Call and tell them you're coming for the holiday." So I did. Here I am.
Well, I had a literary comment that maybe TK, being a literary person, might tell us her ideas. But Thomas Wolfe wrote this famous book. The title was "You Can't Go Home Again." Oh, I'm sorry. Everybody can hear it. You Can't Go Home Again. And the book just, it went where the protagonist, who was an author, wrote a book about basically the town that he grew up in, which is probably Asheville, North Carolina. And when he came back, that he was expected to be, this roaring welcome, he was really criticized. And people didn't like the way he wrote about their city. And so he pondered this, and he just wondered whether you just cannot go home again because you have changed over time. The place, and I'm not talking physically, but in many ways, this place has changed in its own way, and it's just not the same when a person goes back to their home. So I'd like to lay that out there, see what maybe TK has to say about it. But there's some other comments that I'd like to make about a Jewish aspect of this.
So
It's
I'll
like
quickly
you
throw
can't-
out the counterpoint, which is
you can't step in the same water twice, in the same river twice.
Right.
I'll throw out the counterpoint, which is there's a great Bon Jovi song, if you haven't heard it, that he did with Jennifer Nettles of Sugarland, called it's called, like, the chorus is "Who Says You Can't Go Home." Like, he talks about how he spends his childhood wanting to leave and wanting to get out of this town, and now the chorus is like, "I've been all around the world, and as a matter of fact, there's only one place left I want to go." So, TK, I just want to make the counterpoint, and then you can chime in.
No, I hear you. And to that, I would say there's a, gosh, oh man, the author's name just flew out of my head. The old classic writer wrote about the bluebird. It's a quest story about a man that's looking for the meaning of life. Anyway, he's searching for this beautiful bluebird, and he goes all over the world. And when he comes back, he looks in his backyard and sees the bluebird, which is what you're saying. But from an author standpoint, yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that my reception in places that is not home is greater, is more enthusiastic than how I'm treated here. But that's okay. It's still home.
I
But
hope
that's
we're
true.
treating you well.
Do what?
I hope we're treating you well.
Yes, yes, you are.
This is such an apt discussion because I am headed to the place where I'm going to a bunch of places, but I'm ending up in Baltimore with an evening of people that I grew up with. And it's interesting will be interesting to see what going home is like.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, this book, "You Can't Go Home Again," really had nothing to do with religion, but
Right.
just listening to Eddie in particular and Barbara comment about, because they were not born and raised in Birmingham, but they moved here. Judaism was the thread that brought them together with their community. And hopefully the Jewish community, hopefully Birmingham in particular, has open arms when people come to the community from elsewhere, from a different experience, and it can make life that much more meaningful.
That was certainly my experience in coming to Birmingham, where I knew, nobody but my daughter and, a bit of her family, and the Jewish community at Bethel has just made Birmingham, has been such a welcoming experience for me, and really made Birmingham kind of a home for me.
Margaret, you don't have to be from far away. I feel the same thing about the welcome to me to study and to know Bethel. You would think it was in another, not a county or a state, but just another part of the world. But it's been very welcoming. And I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed it.
Rabbi, you're also
And
a Birmingham.
And Barb, I don't find I've been in groups at Emmanuel and not found this degree
No,
of in real scholarship or where something comes from, what it means, Hebrew. I like deep dive.
Well, that's what you get when you get into a class with Barbara and Margaret and Stuart and Eddie and TK. So,
when I
you get some
first-
high scholarship when you're around these people.
when I first came to Birmingham, I wasn't living here. I was just visiting my children, and I went to because I had more familiarity with the Reform movement. And basically very little knowledge of Hebrew. I went to a few events at Emmanuel and was just sorely disappointed, both with the scholarship and with the sense of the community.
The
So
sense of belonging socially, it seems to be quite stratified. And yeah, I want to, this is not exactly on the topic, but in my family, we were all taught from my grandfather, who was the immigrant, we were all taught to go off to school, learn as much as you can, study as long as you want, he told my father, but please bring it back. This place needs you. And my dad heard that. I heard that. I, to a certain degree, influenced both of my children who came back. And I don't know, when you get to the seventh generation, and Birmingham hasn't made some of those, Birmingham and America haven't made those major changes that have to be made for us to continue living in a democracy. You just wonder if you want to tell your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren that same thing.
So here's kind of something that I've been thinking about a little bit along those lines is, some of this conversation opened with Rabbi Sacks's comment on how tshuva as a way of coming home was sparked somewhat by the 6-Day War. And part of the question, I think, Stuart, you were the one who raised it, was, is October 7th going to play that same role in Jewish life? I guess part of my question is, have we prepared our kids to be able to do that? Or have we prepared ourselves to be able to do that?
Can you say more explicitly what you mean by that? I'm not quite sure what.
To become a Baal Tshuva and to return to a Jewish life in the way that Rabbi Sacks did in 1967.
I
A
think
lot of it depends on what you mean by a Jewish life. I mean, just by declaring yourself a Jew, in some ways is, do you
Okay,
have
fair.
to?
Let me rephrase maybe then. As a literate Jew, um,
So
Ask
I
the
see quite
question
the
again.
opposite.
huh?
I said, so far I see quite the opposite.
Say more.
Um, well, I don't see people. I see people acting emotionally, which is easy to do in these circumstances, without accumulating any literacy in terms of knowledge of history, or anything, or even knowledge of practice.
Barbara, were you going to say something before?
I was gonna say that I think maybe we've done kids a disservice now by only educating them in some things about Israel. Because I think when our kids are young, everything is lovely, beautiful, pro-Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was Margaret who said people have an emotional reaction. And from what many Jewish kids today, college campuses or not, many Jewish kids today are comfortable with is only some of what's at play here. So their concerns might be more to the feeling sorry for what they've been told is the underdog and jumping in with something that they're not really fully aware of. But there's definitely not the pro-Israel unquestioned attitude that I'm not saying you have to be well-informed and totally informed, but I think it's hard to make a proper decision without information. So I'm concerned that we have not forced this generation to, or we've not provided to this generation, whether it was the parents who dropped their kids off at religious school and never, did anything themselves and just gave them token association with Israel, or it was the ones who all they ever heard was rah, 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 Israel, that we don't have a generation that is looking at the October 7th situation in an educated way. So I think you need to be able to, for today's college kids, I think that they are poorly informed, whether they're being criticized for being misinformed, they're definitely being poorly informed about things. I think one of the most interesting things I've seen is the photographs of the encampments at various colleges. And I think the two I saw were UCLA and Columbia, where the tents for the protesters all look like they came from the same
REI. They're all from REI.
I wasn't going to give them the expense of an REI tent, but from the same order at Walmart. Provided by who? Who's sponsoring this? What's going on? And on the hand where the Jewish kids today, the Jewish college students are saying, yeah, I'm part of this. I care about Israel, and I also care about hurting people in Gaza. they're not stepping away and thinking logically about who's asking me to participate in this, you know.
Mm.
Am I just jumping in with the crowd? What's going on? Because I think the one that, or the issue that we need to be concerned about is the Jewish kids, not the protests themselves. Because I did admit to myself that I was seriously lucky that I was after Kent State, and the most serious thing that we got into trouble with on campus was the guys streaking. Y'all remember streaking? I mean, if that's the most serious, bad, horrible, town didn't like it thing that happened to you in college, blessings on your head, go streak. Encourage your kids to stop picketing, go streak. But I think information is something that maybe we have not done a good job of providing to today's 20-year-olds and college age kids.
Any
And
responses?
anybody go streaking?
I must say, I mean, we have a very strong mishpacha, Jewish mishpacha, and yet there are two nieces, nephews in our extended family that are horrified with what's going on, with what Israel is doing, you know, in Gaza. And that's an emotional thing. I think they know, I mean, they've listened to the news, they know all the facts that I know, and their reaction at that age. And I think this is a generational change. I think it's a generational issue. And Barbara, since you deal with college age kids, I like your remarks on that, but this is alienating these people, these nieces and nephews from our family. It's alienating them from, you know, we go to the beach every year. We have 70, 80 people come in July for a week at the beach. They're not coming. I mean, it is a major issue for them. So how do we, I don't think educating them relative to the facts is going to change their mind. If you can change their emotions, and I don't know how to do that, that would be, I think, where the success might be.
You know, there's an interesting book that that Abe Schuster recommended to me. I think he got it from Bethany Slater. Anyhow, Abe and I don't know, a couple of other people are reading it, and it seemed so interesting that I suggested it to a reading group that I belong to, and we're reading it. Anyhow, it's called The Identity Trap. And I think it's a very scary and very worthwhile book. But what you're saying, Stuart, where you're this divide, where there's the rest of your family has a certain identity, it seems to me, and these young people may have adopted, you know, a different identity, and these identities are dividing all of us in a very pernicious kind of way, and substituting for a lot of other things, intellectual things, emotional things, allegiance to institutions and so on. It's a sad thing to hear.
What was the name of it? It was The Identity what?
The Identity Trap.
Trap. Okay.
Yeah. The author is Monk, M-O-U-N-K.
Thank you.
And Stuart, they may just have to age out of it, where they gain some more perspective and a little more maturity before they they have the understanding of what's really going on, and that's painful to go through, but I think that
Well,
happened.
well, it is scary because this is very visceral on their part, extremely visceral. And you have to wonder 20 years from now, 30 years from now, what that generation is going to be like relative to the support of Israel. I don't know.
Well, the support of Israel could stop tomorrow. Well, not tomorrow, but in November with the election. I mean, that doesn't even necessarily correlate with the Jewish kids, which I assume is who you're going to be talking about.
Well, in our families, the kids are all from generations where there always was an Israel, and they don't know
Mm.
the pre-Israel. They don't.
Right.
They are not experienced with the pre-Israel feeling or the situation of not having Israel.
Right. I know of a girl who Jewish, brought up Jewish, that says Jews can go anywhere now. They can be anywhere, no problem. And I'm like, they can't even be in the United States with no problem right now.
I say I would not sure I would recommend her trying to fly to Iran, but
Yeah. Well, as if we have a choice of many places that we could go to and not be in any kind of danger. And therefore their support was for the Gazans.
You note that on your passport, it's never stamped that you've been in Israel.
Really?
Really, really, they give you a separate little card that you can preserve, but there's no stamp on the passport that says that you've been in Israel, because that prevents you, that having that stamp on the passport would prevent you from going other places.
I had that because I was going to work in Syria. I was going to work in Kuwait, and they didn't let me into Jordan. But anyway, we're talking early in my geophysical career when I was assigned to be working on projects in different places. Kuwait had just arranged a deal with Israel. Syria had not. I had to get rid of my passport that had all the Israel stamps in it, a ton, and then get a new passport to be able to get into Syria. And in those days, it still was stamped. And I did not want to go back that summer to Israel with a Syria stamp in my passport. So I had to beg the passport agency to, come on, hurry up. I need a new passport. And I had to go through horrendous interviews to be able to do it.
Yeah.
But then when I went to Israel, they hadn't an official thing yet, but I had the Israel stamp on a separate piece of paper, so that if I was going back to Syria, I would be okay. It ended up I never went back to
What
Syria.
year was this, Barbara?
Before I had kids, so we're talking 35 years ago, something like that. So early 80s.
Mhm. I couldn't go to finish my art history survey by going to Egypt after I went to Italy. To Israel. Never, and I've never been able to see it because of that.
Mm.
yeah, I'm still struck by the argument of, there's lots of places Jews can go. There's also lots of places Palestinians can go. So I mean that's kind of a flawed argument.
Well,
In Syria,
I mean,
you see the camps.
are there? As I understand, the Ghazians are not allowed into They don't want them anywhere.
Well,
So
yeah.
can they
So I
go?
mean, there's a few different reasons for that, but that we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But you know, coming back, I think to Rabbi Sacks's point, not the direction I was going to take this conversation, but that's okay too. So how do we kind of reframe, or what do we do to make a environment in which we can use we can promote Jewish return post October 7th and return to Judaism, not necessarily Israel, but Judaism in general?
It depends.
People
on
have
how
to
far
learn.
Go ahead, Margaret.
I was going to say that young people have to learn to be able to keep two things in their head at the same time. And that's difficult to do. That's very difficult to do. You root for the Yankees or you root for the Dodgers. It's very difficult to have two thoughts in your head at the same time.
Those are both wrong. You root for the Cubs, but that's
well, actually, you root for the Phillies, but that's
And Margaret, you're showing
Orioles,
your
but,
age. The Dodgers haven't been in New York in so long.
Well,
you can
yes,
still root for the Dodgers, though.
Yeah.
The Senators are a little more challenging to root for these days.
But the idea of being the intellectual skill of being of being able to keep two things in your head at the same time, I think is something that that not everybody can do, and that needs somehow to be taught. So you can,
I think a question about Baal Teshuvah is, doesn't it mean different things if you're conservative or reform than it does if you're Orthodox? Because when you think of the BT population, they're all Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, or, if you were just, who do you look around the Bethel congregation? And I wouldn't consider myself that, having come back when I was in my 30s, but it was a coming back. But I didn't go all the way. Do I still count?
So, I mean, look, I think it's a little bit of a semantic argument there, in that the only ones who are really referring to themselves as Baalei Tshuva are the Orthodox. Doesn't mean you can't be a Baal Tshuva otherwise. It just means you don't usually get a lot of Reform and Conservative throwing the term of Jews or throwing that term around. Doesn't mean you're not. It just means we're not throwing that term around as if we are.
I'm waiting for you to introduce me to somebody as a Baal Teshuvah, because you've heard this. And who else? And Eddie and
me
and Margaret.
Well, Rabbi, it seems like we have to show that generation that there's value in being Jewish. Until I would say until October 7th, I would think most of us didn't really feel physically threatened in any way for being Jewish. Now we do. I think now there's an element of that. It should be in everybody. So if we can figure out how to get them to come home, come back to Judaism, because there's value in it. There's value in numbers. There's value in strength. There's value in being educated about things. There's value in helping what's going on in campuses. But I think it gets to be, to me, something practical. They have to see something tangible, that they need to come back to Judaism, because it's going to be good for them. It's going to be good for all of us.
So here's the challenge in that is, I think a lot of those youngins that you get that we're discussing and imagining don't see themselves as outside of Judaism. They actually see their support for the Palestinians as a outgrowth of their Judaism that they were brought up with. So for them, they see it as, this is what I was taught. This is what you taught me it means to be a Jew. I'm just doing what you taught me to do.
That's
Well,
part of
we-
what I meant by having two thoughts of you in your mind, being able to hold two things in your mind at the same time. Both the value, the Jewish values, and the ways in which those values have fallen short, but still be able to conceive of seeing those values being embodied in the Jewish state.
Yeah, and to get somewhat Hasidic here, values I feel are kind of a problematic term and a problematic thing to be focusing on. Because values are like water. What's the problem with water?
It evaporates, it runs through your fingers, it changes.
If you don't have a place to put it, it does whatever it wants. If you pour out water onto a table to drink it, but there's no cup, the water is just going to go wherever it goes. You need a vessel in which to put the water and to contain the water and to have the water have a place to go that you're directing it to. Values are somewhat similar. You need vessels, values in and of themselves are abstract concepts. If you don't embody them somewhere and you don't teach about how you embody them somewhere, then eventually they're going to have to figure out some way to be embodied. And I think, on some extent, I think at least the Jews we're talking about, I want to be honest in that there's a lot and probably a majority of young Jews on campus who are not in the pro-Palestinian camps. So let's just be honest about that. But I think those that are, we didn't give them a Jewish vessel in which to embody the values that we were teaching them. So what did they do? They found a different vessel to put them in. And as they see it, it's a perfectly valid vessel of Jewish values. You disagree with them, that's fine, but that's not how they're seeing it.
I think I was using the word value to more mean like a positive attribute that we need to see. They need to see that that's helpful to them, and not the other word of value, which is harder to describe. But I think you're doing a good job at it.
But again, I do think they see themselves as embodying positive values. They're embodying justice. They're embodying righteousness. They're embodying truth. They're embodying tikkun olam. They see themselves as doing
that. Only up to a certain point, unless they're completely ignorant of what from the river to the sea means.
So again, I'm not disagreeing with you in principle. I'm just saying, I think even if they aren't ignorant as to what it means, I've had conversations with Jews who have said, like, Israel has no right to exist. We took it from Arab individuals. It shouldn't be there. We want to land, we should find somewhere else to go. We don't need that land. We should give it back to them and find somewhere else to go.
Well, where? I mean, you know.
Well, I'm just saying, like, that's, but for them, that's an embodiment of their Judaism.
Hmm.
So,
What advice can you give Stuart that he can, two things that he can work on?
Let me write this down. Go ahead.
one, and this might be the way to end it, end our class today. You can love someone without agreeing with them, is I think the most important one, is that we have to kind of get out of this frame of you disagree with me, therefore we can't get along. And that goes both ways. So, your family who doesn't want to come to the beach has to be willing to come to the beach and say, you're still my family. I still love you, even though we very strongly disagree on this issue that is very important to all of us. And two, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. There's no way to actually get through any of this. As I kind of said in my Passover sermon, the only way out of slavery is through the wilderness. The wilderness is difficult, it's hard, it's scary, we don't know what's out there, but it's the only way to get through. So you have difficult conversations, hopefully with an open mind. And, you might say, you know what? Actually, I'll give you an example. I'm not 100% sure what school it was. My wife thought it was Hofstra, but she wasn't 100% sure. Which she was telling me how, they wanted to set up encampments for a pro-Palestinian protest. And the administration said, here's the deal. You can do that. But the second that you start intimidating other students, it's gone. We will not tolerate any intimidation, harassment, violence, or anything. You want to peacefully protest, you have the right to peacefully protest. But if it gets any step above it, we're taking it down. Fine. So they set up their camp, and the Jewish student group said, why do we have a dialogue? Like, instead of just attacking each other, why don't we sit down and have a dialogue? So they sat in the encampment. A couple of each leaders got together, they created a panel, and they had a conversation, and they went back and forth, and they had a discussion, and they came out saying, you know what, we hear you, we understand where you're coming from, we disagree, but we respect where you're coming from. And both sides were able to sit down and say that and walk away, and they tore down the encampment and walked away.
They were
Everybody
holding
got
two
heard.
things in their head.
Yeah. So you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. You have to be uncomfortable to say, I'm willing to have this conversation, even though I'm probably going to disagree. But I want to hear you out and hear where you're coming from. I'm going to probably tell you why I disagree, and you're going to have to be comfortable hearing why I think you're wrong. And then we can at least come to some mutual understanding of, I disagree with you, but I still care and love you. And until we're able to do that, probably internationally as well, things aren't going to move very.
I think that sounds like a great thing, but I'm wondering if it works only if they are truly getting their ideas from just their own personal experience, not being kind of brainwashed, it seems, by a group like Hamas. So I can't see that if they were what would be the word? Yeah, not interrogated.
Indoctrinated.
Yes,
Yeah.
indoctrinated by Hamas to think this way, that they would not be satisfied with just an exchange of views, and you have a right to your view, I have a right to my view, let's part ways and just understand that we don't agree with each other. I have a hard
So-
time thinking that that's going to happen.
So two things on that. One part I left out is you're going to have to be educated enough to bring actual facts with you to the table for that conversation. Not speculation, not propaganda on either side, not you're going to have to come with like actual facts of what's happening. That's one. Two, you're right. This conversation isn't going to work with everyone. And some people are just going to be not going to want to have the conversation at all. That's true with pretty much everything in life is, some people just don't want the conversation. But you don't try, then you don't get anywhere either. By saying that, Netanyahu and Sinwar are going to sit down and to be able to hash everything out together, like in a room together, probably not. But if it's important to you to have the conversation, then it's worth the effort.
And if you have something that brings you to the conversation, that makes it important, something like the ties in Stuart's family, then you have a better chance than buttonholing somebody on the street. You have something, a history of love and caring and everything else to work with.
Because that's next week's chapter, love.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Thank you, Barbara. I will not be here next week, so find Howard to start the Zoom for you guys. But kol hakavod to you. Thank you for your conversation today, and I'll look forward to learning with y'all again in 2 weeks, as you guys, in the words of old Mike Myers, you talk amongst yourselves. And
Thank you, Rabbi. Your advice was great. I really.
Kol hakavod to you, Rabbi.
If I don't see you, Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and learn again together soon.
And
Sorry, I was late.
next
No
week,
worries. You're here.
we're here. I'm in the habit of calling Howard and reminding him that he has to open it for us.